One stormy night in the Montana wilderness, an elderly woman opened her door expecting the wind. Instead, she found a dying German Shepherd mother, a fading puppy, and a secret that would change the final years of her life forever. No one could explain how the dog still stood until the moment she shielded the woman with the last breath she had left. What happened next is a story of loyalty so deep it follows you long after the snow melts. Before we begin, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Snow drifted like torn feathers across the pines, and the wind carried an old, tired groan along the roofline of the cabin. Margaret Hayes had lived long enough to understand the language of winter. At 50, she moved slowly but with purpose, her dark brown parka lifted by the draft each time she crossed the narrow room. The years had carved quiet lines along her eyes, and the solitude had taught her to listen, to the stove ticking, to the timber settling, and to her own breath, steady but lonelier than she cared to admit. She had retired from the Ranger service 5 winters ago, yet the instinct to watch the world, to read it, had never left her. So when the faintest scratch brushed the door, thin as a thread of sound, she stopped. And she listened. She opened the door into a wall of white. The storm pushed forward like a living thing, but in its heart lay a shape, low, trembling, clinging to the last thread of strength. A German Shepherd, her coat, black and tan, stiff with ice, and pressed against her belly, a small pup, barely breathing. The mother dog looked up, her amber eyes clouded by exhaustion, but holding something older than fear. Margaret had seen that look before, on rescue dogs trapped in wildfire smoke, on animals who had run too far, too long, because something small needed them to keep going. She knelt, her boots sinking into snow already filling the doorway. The pup shuddered weakly. The mother swayed. And for a moment, everything was just breath and cold, and the fragile hope between them. She carried the pup inside first, cupping his tiny body beneath her gloves. When she turned back, another figure appeared at the edge of the porch. A second German Shepherd, leaner, wilder, ribs rising sharply beneath its fur. Lost, starving, eyes darting, frantic from the storm. The dog lowered its head, lips tight with the kind of desperation that made even gentle creatures forget themselves. Margaret froze. She had no weapon, no stick, nothing but the weight of her breath in the cold air. But then the mother dog, who had been barely conscious moments before, forced herself upright. She staggered, then stood in front of Margaret, shoulders squared, though her legs trembled. A sound rose from her chest, not loud, but deep, protective, the voice of a mother who had nothing left to give except everything. The stray hesitated. The wind howled, and then, with a flick of its tail, it turned away and vanished into the white. The mother dog collapsed again, her strength extinguished as quickly as it had flared. Margaret sank beside her, hands shaking, not from fear, but from something older, something she had not felt in years. The storm pressed in around the cabin, but inside, a fragile warmth was beginning to form. She brought the mother dog in, laying her near the fire. The pup curled against her, his breath thin but present. Margaret sat beside them, listening to the wind claw at the windows. She had spent years turning away from connections, too many losses, too many goodbyes. Yet here, in this small cabin, winter had placed a choice at her feet. She watched the firelight flicker along the dog's fur, and an old truth stirred quietly inside her. Sometimes the world sends us the ones we need to save, so they can save us in return. Outside, the storm had softened, leaving only the hush of snow settling on the old wooden roof. Margaret moved quietly across the cabin, her steps slow, careful, as if she feared the walls might crumble beneath the weight of her breath. At 50, she wore her years plainly, the silver threaded through her brown hair, the tired grace in her shoulders, the simple parka still dusted with frost. Yet something gentle stirred in her tonight, something she had not felt in a long while. The mother dog lay curled near the hearth, a German shepherd with black and tan fur stiffened by cold. Her body was trembling, but her eyes, those amber eyes, followed every movement Margaret made. The pup beside her, no larger than 2 hands cupped together, breathed in small, fragile bursts. And Margaret felt the room shift around them, as if winter itself had paused to listen. She warmed Scout first. The little one was barely a whisper of life, so light, so still, that she had to hold him near her face to feel the faint brush of breath. She wrapped him in an old wool blanket, its edges frayed from years of service, and rubbed small circles along his spine. The fire crackled softly, and the scent of burning pine rose into the air, mingling with the distant groan of the storm. Across the room, the mother dog lifted her head, weak but watchful. There was no threat in her posture now, only the faint ache of a creature balancing between fear and surrender. Margaret knew that posture. She had lived it in her own way, after the losses, after the nights when silence felt sharper than any knife. Shadow, as Margaret would later call her, tried to rise but failed. Her paws slipped beneath her. Her chest fell heavy against the wooden floor. But her eyes, they never left Scout, nor Margaret, and in that gaze was a plea older than language. Keep him safe. Keep us safe. Margaret knelt beside her, speaking in a low, steady voice, the same way she had once soothed injured animals in her ranger days. The dog blinked slowly, fighting exhaustion, but she did not pull away. Not this time. Not from this woman. Hours passed, the night deepened, and sometime after midnight, the cabin took on a different quiet, less brittle, less haunted. Scout whimpered for the first time, a small sound, frayed at the edges, but full of life returning. Shadow lifted her head again, just an inch, just enough to see him, and a tremor of relief moved through her body. She pushed her nose toward him, touching the blanket, and then turned her gaze toward Margaret. Gratitude lived in that look, raw and wordless. It struck Margaret deeper than she expected. She swallowed hard, surprised by how quickly this fragile connection had rooted itself in her heart. By the second night, exhaustion overtook her. She sat near the fire, her hands folded in her lap, her thoughts drifting like the snow outside. She thought of the years alone, the nights when no one knocked on her door, the way she had learned to accept loneliness as something fixed and permanent. And it was there, between wakefulness and dreaming, that she felt something warm pressed gently against her boot. Shadow. The dog had dragged herself across the floor, inch by inch, until she rested her head on Margaret's foot, not seeking warmth, not seeking rescue, just closeness, a quiet offering of trust. Margaret did not move. She only breathed, slowly, letting the moment settle deep inside her. In the soft glow of the fire, she understood something simple and profound. Healing does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes it comes on 4 weak legs, wrapped in silence, and lays its head where your loneliness used to live. Morning light drifted softly across the cabin floor, pale and gentle, like a memory trying to return. The storm had passed, leaving the world muted and still. Margaret moved slowly, her joints heavy from sleep, yet the weariness felt different now, less like a burden and more like the warmth that follows a long-held breath. Shadow, the German shepherd, rose with her, padding close at her heel. The dog's coat had regained some of its luster, and though she still moved with caution, her steps carried a quiet certainty. Scout, the smaller one, darted between table legs and chair posts, his black and tan fur brushing against the wood like a whisper of new life. Margaret, 50 and solitary for too many years, watched them with an ache she could not quite name. Something softened in her chest each time Shadow met her eyes, as if the dog were gently reminding her she wasn't as alone as she'd once believed. The cabin settled into a rhythm. The fire breathed steadily. The air smelled of pine, wool, and the faint sweetness of thawing snow. Margaret prepared small meals, nothing fancy, just broth and scraps warmed on the stove, and Shadow stayed beside her, matching her movements with patient devotion. Sometimes the dog would pause, tilt her head, and study Margaret's hands as though memorizing the shape of them. Scout played nearby, occasionally nudging her boot for attention. And in these simple rituals, Margaret felt time loosen its grip. She remembered mornings long ago, the sound of her husband's laughter, the way life had once felt whole. Grief had carved her deeply, but as she looked at the two dogs sharing her small space, she sensed something shifting, subtle as the changing light. One night, the wind returned, not as fierce as before, but strong enough to rattle the shutters. A sudden bang echoed through the cabin when the door swung open, slammed by a gust. Margaret startled, her breath caught halfway in her chest. Before she could rise, Shadow lunged forward, not with aggression, but with purpose. The dog planted herself between Margaret and the cold air, body poised, gaze fixed on the darkness beyond. Scout froze, ears pinned, tail tucked, while Shadow's stance remained unwavering. Margaret watched the scene with a quiet, growing understanding. This wasn't fear. This was protection. A promise made without words. The kind of bond forged only through shared survival, through nights where one life depended on another. When the door was secured again, Shadow returned to Margaret's side. The dog didn't seek praise or touch. She simply settled near her feet, a silent sentinel ready for whatever came next. Margaret felt the truth settle deep inside her. If she had saved them from the storm, then now they were saving her from the emptiness she had carried for too long. By morning, the cabin was warm again. Margaret woke in her worn armchair, a blanket still draped across her lap. And there, on the rug beside her, Shadow lay, curled close, her breathing steady, her presence calm and steadying. Scout slept tucked against his mother's belly. Margaret watched them for a long time, letting the quiet fill her, letting the gratitude she felt rise and soften the sharp edges of her heart. She reached down, touching the tips of Shadow's fur. The dog stirred, but didn't move away. For the first time in years, Margaret whispered a promise, not loud, not even fully formed, but enough for the room to hear. We stay, all of us, for as long as life allows. It was not a vow spoken to the world, only to the silence that had once consumed her. Now that silence seemed warmer, like a room finally lived in again. Afternoon light drifted pale and thin across the snow, the kind that makes the world feel farther away than it truly is. Margaret stepped outside with careful feet, her boots sinking into the softened crust of ice. The air carried a quiet chill, not sharp, but steady, like a reminder that winter never truly loosened its grip in these mountains. At 50, she moved with the slow steadiness of someone who had learned respect for the land, for its moods and its warnings. Her parka wrapped around her shoulders, the faded brown fabric pressed close to her aging frame. Inside the cabin, Shadow watched her through the cracked door, ears flicking, her black and tan coat catching glints of firelight. Scout slept near the hearth, small breaths rising like tiny puffs of fog. And somewhere in Margaret's heart, a fragile sense of belonging had begun to take root. So soft, she was almost afraid to touch it. She crouched near a patch of ice beneath the slope, wanting to check the ground before nightfall. But the surface shifted beneath her, silent and treacherous. In an instant, her foot slipped. The world tilted. Snow rushed past her vision. She slid downward, helpless against the weight of winter's pull, until her leg struck a fallen log with a crack so sharp it stole the breath from her throat. She lay still, her body half buried, her leg pinned. The pain came next, bright, burning, merciless. She tried to call out, but the wind, steady and indifferent, carried her voice away. For a moment, She thought of how quiet the world had become, of how easy it would be to surrender to that quiet again. But somewhere deep within her, the memory of Shadow's warm head resting against her foot flickered like a spark refusing to die. Inside the cabin, Shadow stiffened. She rose suddenly, ears pricked, body trembling with a tension older than instinct. She nudged Scout awake with a firm push, then bolted toward the door. The cold air burst into the cabin as she ran, her paws carving dark shapes into the snow. She found Margaret at the base of the slope, her breathing shallow, her hair tangled against the frost. Shadow lowered her head and touched Margaret's cheek with a cold nose, a soft whine breaking the silence. Margaret's eyes fluttered open. Relief washed through her, mixed with something like disbelief. Shadow barked once, sharp, commanding, then turned to Scout. The pup understood far more than his age suggested. He ran, small legs pumping, disappearing into the direction of the cabin. Shadow pressed her warm body against Margaret, trying to share what heat she had. Her coat brushed against the woman's trembling frame, the rhythm of her breath steady and grounding. Then she turned toward the fallen log. She pushed. The wood groaned but did not move. She pushed again, claws slipping on ice. The effort tore at her healing muscles. On the third attempt, her paw slid, sharp stones slicing her shoulder and staining her fur. She staggered, but did not fall. Instead, she growled low and deep, the sound not of anger, but of a vow. Gathering all the strength left inside her, she braced her paws and heaved once more. This time the log rolled, just enough for Margaret to pull her leg free. Scout returned, dragging the wool scarf clamped in his small teeth. Together, mother and pup positioned themselves beside Margaret. Shadow nudged her arm over the scarf, guiding, urging, insisting. Leaning against them, Margaret let herself be moved. Inch by inch, they pulled her toward home, their breaths weaving with hers in the cold air. When the cabin door finally closed behind them, she collapsed into tears, not from the pain, but from the truth settling deep inside her. She had saved them once, but they had saved her in ways she had never known she needed. Spring came quietly that year, as if afraid to disturb what winter had taught them. The snow thinned first along the edges of the pines, melting into dark lines of earth. The air changed too, still cool, still carrying the whisper of mountains, but softened by the smell of thawing soil and distant water. Margaret moved more slowly now, her injured leg wrapped beneath layers of wool. She leaned on the old cane her husband once carved, a simple piece of hickory, smooth from years of his hands. Shadow watched her with an attentive stillness, her black and tan coat catching the morning light in subtle glimmers. Scout, larger now and steadier on his paws, followed her steps like a shadow of his own. It was in these small, quiet moments that Margaret felt something like peace settle over her, a peace she had not known since before grief had hollowed her life. Yet she understood what spring meant. She saw it in the way Shadow lifted her head toward the tree line, in the way Scout's ears perked at distant sounds. The forest called to them, not loudly, but with the gentle insistence of something familiar and true. Margaret had lived long enough to know that love sometimes meant letting go, but knowing did not ease the ache. One morning, as sunlight drifted over the cabin floor in long golden bands, she opened the door and stepped aside. She offered no words, only the quiet permission of someone who had made peace with heartbreak. Shadow nudged Scout forward. Together they walked toward the edge of the clearing. Their paws pressed softly into the thawed ground, leaving shallow prints that the wind did not yet dare to erase. At the forest's boundary, Shadow stopped. Her body, still carrying the scar from the stone that cut her shoulder, stood tall and certain. She turned back. Margaret saw the intelligence in her amber eyes, the same eyes that had once pleaded for help in a storm, the same eyes that had burned with determination as they freed her from the fallen log. Shadow walked back toward her, slow, deliberate. In her mouth, she carried something small and metallic. She lowered it onto Margaret's palm, a weathered tag, the remnant of an old canine collar. The edges were worn, the engraving was faint. But Margaret understood. This was a piece of Shadow's past, a life she had lived before loss and cold and wandering, a life she had survived. The dog had carried it through winter, through pain, through nights of near death, and now she was giving it away, as if shedding the final weight of everything that had once broken her. Margaret closed her fingers around the tag. Something inside her trembled, not with sorrow, but with gratitude so deep it felt like light spreading through the cracks of her heart. Shadow met her gaze once more and blinked, slow, deliberate. A gesture of trust. A goodbye shaped not by sadness, but by the quiet dignity of creatures who understand that love can live even in distance. Then she turned. Scout followed, his tail brushing the grass like a final wave. The two of them slipped into the green hush of the forest until only the tremble of leaves marked their passing. In the days that followed, the cabin felt both emptier and fuller. Margaret kept the tag on the small wooden shelf above the hearth, beside the cane and the photograph of her husband. Some mornings, before the sun reached the windows, she would step outside and stand in the cool air. And there, pressed softly into the soil, she would find them, two prints, one large, one small, left not by accident, but by intention. A reminder, a promise, a quiet way of saying, we're still here, we haven't forgotten. And Margaret would breathe a little easier, holding spring in her lungs, knowing that even in letting go, she had not truly lost anything at all. Sometimes life grows quieter as we grow older, and the world feels a little heavier with loneliness, sickness, and memories that ache. But stories like this remind us that love can still find its way back to us, in small footsteps, in loyal hearts, in unexpected moments of grace. If this touched you, please share your thoughts in the comments. Pass this story to someone who needs hope today, and subscribe for more gentle reminders that you are never forgotten. May God bless you, keep you strong, and surround your days with peace.